Australia's labour productivity is basically which is GDP per hour worked. So it's how much economic growth we derive out of every hour worked. It's basically been stagnant since 2016, right? So it's had it's basically been flat since 2016. It's the worst performance in the advanced world. Canada has also been very poor, but we've had the worst productivity growth. If you look over here on the left side, upper left chart, it breaks down our productivity growth by, again, as I mentioned earlier, the market sector, which is basically the private sector, versus the non-market sector, which is, as I said before, is those in the economy that are effectively government-funded type roles. So NDIS, public servants, etc. Unfortunately, while the market sectors experience pretty decent growth, productivity growth, labour productivity growth over the last 20 years, unfortunately, the non-market sector has actually experienced zero productivity growth in 20 years. And that is one of the reasons why Australia has such poor productivity. As I mentioned earlier, about 60% of the jobs since the pandemic have been in this non-market sector, most of those related to the NDIS. The NDIS has grown in costs, grown in number of people working in it, etc., has ballooned in costs in the last 5 years. It's also projected to roughly double in nominal terms over the next decade to about 100 million people. As we've done that, we have a higher share of the population working in this non-market sector, that necessarily means you're going to get lower productivity growth. But it's not the only driver. So that's one of the drivers for Australia's poor productivity growth. It's actually probably a minor driver, I'd say, in the scheme of things. Another one is that we've deindustrialised. So I have this chart elsewhere in this pack, but Australia's manufacturing share shrunk from about 15% in the late 70s to 5% of Australia's economy currently. And even 20 years ago, it was about 10% of the economy. So we've got this shrinking manufacturing sector. We're deindustrialising. And the reason why we're doing that has been a whole bunch of reasons. So obviously we abolished tariffs in the 1980s, which meant that our manufacturing became less competitive against manufacturing overseas, which shrunk manufacturing. We also had, obviously, the commodity boom during, the 2000s commodity price boom that pushed up the Australian dollar. So if you're listening to this, you might remember when the Australian dollar actually surpassed the US dollar. We had a very high currency there for a while. And what that did was that shrunk our manufacturing sector. That was one of the reasons why the auto sector left, because it became cheaper to make cars in Korea than in Australia because the Australian dollar was too high. And then more recently, and this is, the biggest structural problem I think we've got going forward, is we've given ourselves expensive energy prices. And we'll touch on this a bit later, but Australia's energy costs are rocketing because of the, strive towards net zero, which has just added a whole bunch of cost to everything, as well as we've stuffed up the gas market. And these higher energy costs, both gas and electricity, have meant that it's become uneconomic to manufacture in Australia. And in the last several years, we've seen thousands of manufacturers go under, but we've seen some really big ones too. So Australia's last plastic manufacturer, Quinos, went broke last year, closed shop. Now we don't make plastics in Australia anymore. Our last architectural glass maker, Oceanic Glass, which did the windows for Parliament House in Canberra, they closed this year because of high gas prices. The plastic manufacturer shut down because of high gas prices as well. We've seen, fertiliser makers like Incitec Pivot downsize and close their operations. Orica, which makes explosives for mining and fertilisers, is looking to downsize as well. Left, right and centre, these high energy costs are deindustrialising the country. And why that matters is because manufacturing across the world is one of the key drivers of productivity growth, because it's one area where you can invest in more technology, in more machines, etc., and get more output for every input that you put into it. You can increase the capital to labour ratio. You can get more productivity. But as we've shrunk manufacturing to the lowest share in the OECD, we have the lowest manufacturing share in the advanced world. It means that we've become more reliant on these services type jobs, these non-market jobs, etc., which are low productivity, and that has killed our productivity as well. And related to this, We've also had capital deepening. So the chart on the top right-hand side shows this in detail, and that's from Jared Minack. The capital to labour ratio, which is basically the amount of equipment, tools, machinery, etc., that workers have to work with. It's basically the amount of capital divided by the number of workers gives you the capital labour ratio. That has absolutely collapsed, and it's collapsed for two reasons. Firstly, partly due to the manufacturing collapse. Our capital investment is sort of running at early 90s recessionary levels. So we're not growing the capital base very much. Part of that's because manufacturing is dead. At the same time, we've grown the population, which is the denominator of that capital labour ratio, aggressively through this high immigration. So Australia's population has grown by 8.7 million people, 46% this century so far. That is the highest growth in the advanced world. That has increased the labour, the denominator of that ratio, and as a result, we've had less machinery, tools, technology, etc., per worker, which has killed our productivity. And Ken Henry, some other researchers, the Productivity Commission, etc., have said that capital deepening, which is an increase in the capital labour ratio, has been the main driver of Australia's productivity growth since the Second World War. And unfortunately, that has gone into decline. We've now got capital shallowing because we're growing the population aggressively, and we're not building enough business. We're not doing enough business investment, infrastructure investment, all that sort of thing to keep up with it. And as a result, we're getting less output per worker, and we're getting declining productivity. And the final reason, Martin, to cut this long-winded story short, we've obviously got this housing obsession, which we've discussed pretty deep, a lot of detail in this podcast already. And classic example, shown in the bottom right chart, where I've compared housing, so mortgage versus business credit. And back in 1990, around 2/3 of bank lending was for businesses, and the rest was for mortgages and personal loans. Nowadays, it's nearly 3/4 of bank lending is now for mortgages, and they lend very little for businesses. About 1/3 is for businesses now. So we've restructured the entire economy in the last 30 years to be so focused on housing. And what that's done is it's bled the productive side, the real economy of capital investment, which is another reason why I've got this low, this low share of business investment, which is leading to the capital shallowing problem. We've become so obsessed with housing that we've killed entrepreneurialism, we've killed investment, and that is also killing our productivity. And sure, there are other minor factors like Australia's our perverse franking credit system, which basically, we have a dividend imputation system here, which isn't common around the world. And what that's done is it's basically encouraged companies to pay high dividends rather than reinvesting in their businesses and into capital investment. So that has been another bit part, reason why we don't invest enough, but it's only a minor thing. But those are basically the four main reasons. We've deindustrialized. We've got this capital shallowing problem because of excessive population growth and not enough investment to keep up with that population growth. We've seen a massive rise in these non-market jobs through things like the NDIS, which are by nature very low productivity. And then finally, we've got this housing obsession in Australia, which has just starved the country of capital for productive purposes, for businesses, for, entrepreneurialism has been killed by the housing obsession, because when you've got a mortgage, you don't want to take risk, right? So I remember it myself when I was working at Goldman Sachs and I had a pretty hefty mortgage. I was very reluctant to start macro business, and I only did it because I got my mortgage down to a level where I could afford to go a year because I'd already prepaid a lot of it. A year without income before I was going to basically have to sell my house, and I could take the punt. But if you've got a massive mortgage debt hanging over your head, you're not going to take those sorts of risks. You're not going to try and be an entrepreneur or, try something new and invest. And also, why would you do that when it seems like, everyone's got it ingrained in their brains that the way to get rich is to, their idea of investment is not to invest into a new business venture. It's just to buy an investment property and sit on the capital gains and watch it go up in value. So that unfortunately is the Australian disease. And, these are all the factors, the reason why Australia has a very poor productivity. And I can't see this changing. at this summit from Treasurer Jim Chalmers. And it's not going to change because, as we've seen, the Albanese government's own policies are to pump the housing bubble even higher. They're not going to change that. They're not going to wind back immigration. In fact, the Centre for Population, which is in the Australian Treasury, their own population forecast for Australia are for the population to grow by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. Now, that's like adding another Sydney, another Melbourne, and another Brisbane, those three cities combined. So if you imagine those three cities now as they currently stand, all the people in those cities, all the housing required, all the business investment required, the Centre for Population forecasts are going to grow by Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, 13.5 million people in just 40 years. Well, obviously, if you're going to add that many people, we're going to need that many people's worth of infrastructure, that many people's worth of business investment, that many people's worth of houses, etc., just to ensure that the capital-labour ratio remains constant, let alone increases. And the fact of the matter is, with that scale of population growth, we can't deepen our capital. We can't increase that capital-labour ratio because we're going to be growing the denominator, the labour, the population, too aggressively. So that's not going to change from this summit. They're not going to suddenly go, you know what, we're going to abandon big Australia. No, it's ingrained, right? They're not going to fix the energy market. Like, if anything, Labor has said that they're going to double down on net zero, and they're going to go harder to, shut down our reliable, cheap, historically cheap baseload power, like coal power, etc., and replace it with intermittent, expensive renewables that don't provide enough power, don't provide power when you need it, cost an absolute fortune in transmission lines and backup storage and all this other stuff. And that's just going to push up our energy costs. So if you have higher energy costs, we're going to continue to deindustrialise, and we're going to have lower productivity growth. So, the three areas here, the housing obsession, the capital problem, the capital deepening, capital shallowing / capital shallowing problem we've got, and the energy problem, which is related to deindustrialisation, are going to remain no matter what this summit comes up with. They might come up with a few little nips and tucks at the edges, but the fact of the matter is, it's not going to solve the structural problems of the country, and it could make it even worse. Like, what I fear, Martin, is that we're going to have a repeat of the 2022 Jobs and Skills Summit, right? So if people remember that summit was stacked with participants, with shills, with pro-migration shills. And the whole purpose of that summit was to be used as a Trojan horse to ramp immigration, to get a fake consensus to ramp immigration to levels that we've never seen before. And as soon as that summit was over, Claire O'Neill, who was the Home Affairs Minister at the time, and Albo and everyone got up there saying, "Oh my God, I just can't believe how much consensus there is. Everyone thinks we need to massively increase immigration. Wow. So here's our recommendations from the summit: more permanent migration, more temporary migration, relax student rules, increase work hours for students, a whole bunch of other stuff. And voila, we got record immigration, right? It was preordained. That whole summit was rigged to ramp immigration because the government needed cover, needed political cover, it needed a Trojan horse to do so without it, so it can look like, oh, look, I was just doing what the summit said. I fear that this productivity summit is going to be used as a Trojan horse to double down even harder on net zero, on other policies that it wants to run, which would actually make the productivity situation even worse. And they'll use it to strike up a fake consensus at the end of it, and they'll use it as a Trojan horse and political cover to basically double down on dumb policies. And they did that in the 2022 Jobs and Skills Summit, and I think I'd be very shocked if they didn't try and do that again. So, no, this is not going to amount to anything of substance for us, and it's not going to improve the trajectory of the country.